there are studies, and then there are studies. What I'm going to review, out of normal for this channel, but what I'm going to review is a study. And I think it's important to talk about it. And I think in particular for those of you worrying about education, this is a good one to talk about. So here we go. So this article came across my Twitter feed earlier today, actually, and I thought when I read it that my initial thought was, oh dear Lord, which I think is a fair way to think about it. This article, as I said in the intro, this article is not a study; it is a study. Here, and which is to say, this is activism masquerading as scholarship, is what this is. Counter-narrative as strategy, embedding critical race theory to develop an anti-racist school identity. This article examines the purposeful use of counter-narrative to develop an anti-racist school identity. Based on a 7-year ethnographic project at an elementary school in the Southeast U.S., it illustrates how counter-narrative can be employed as a strategy to embed critical race theory into school equity discourse, and in doing so, help public schools disrupt majoritarian narratives that deny the salience of race. It argues that by developing counter-narratives rooted in the perspectives and knowledge of teachers of color, and then using those narratives, counter-narratives specifically for the purpose of strategizing, schools and researchers can help CRT achieve its activist function in K-12 schools. Now, those of you following the news have probably heard of many different institutions that denied, like the National Education Association, Terry McAuliffe, a whole bunch of people denied that critical race theory was in schools. I give you this. So I'm going to look through this, and I can't possibly cover the whole article, but I do think it is important to talk about specific aspects of it, because this article, the best way I can describe it for you is it is an activist guidebook, an activist educator's guidebook, an activist administrator's guidebook. For how to get this to work, how to get this in place in a public school or in a school. This is not taught to the kids directly, but it frames everything else, is my assessment of it. I think others who are more versed on the education side may come into that. I think I'm thinking particularly of a couple of the folks who brought this to my attention here, that you may want to look at this, but it has been my misfortune to read through this and break it so I can break it down for you a little bit. And again, this is not scholarship. This is an example of something that has the veneer of peer-reviewed research that is a study. It has the veneer of peer review, the veneer of authority that comes with a peer-reviewed journal. It is a study. It is not a study. It's activism masquerading as scholarship. That is plain and simple what it is. And they are not at all tame about hiding it. They're not bothering to hide it in this, and you will see that. But I do want to get across the point here, because I think what he describes here is something that folks need to know who are actively not wanting critical theory in their schools and think it's not so great, as I tend to, but to know about that. But also, I have some serious critiques, of course, for the article, because I got into peer review mode when I was reading this, and it amazes me again that, well, it doesn't amaze me anymore. And this kind of journal, this is the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, which means there's no data. Actually, there's no quantitative data in here. Their data, I think, is conversations, if I remember correctly, with respect to this article. Anyway, I've got a few points highlighted, so we can try and get through this a little bit more quickly. I will link to the article. The article itself is behind a paywall, but I have a hard copy of it, and I will make that hard copy available for my Locals members. So if you join on Locals, I will make sure that you are capable of getting the hard copy of this article if you would like to read it. And I encourage you to. So, Counter-narrative is a way CRT scholars react to majoritarian narratives on race, but as I will explain, it can also be practiced proactively to lay the groundwork for activism. In this way, counter-narrative is not a product, but rather an integral part of critical race praxis. Now, in the whole arguments about critical race theory that are going on right now, there's people like, no, we're not teaching that in schools. It's only taught in law schools. That's not the issue. Critical race praxis is the pedagogical part of it, of getting it embedded, ingrained in just the everyday talking and knowledge and what have you that's going on. And that's the point that they're making here, is the counter-narrative idea, the counter-narrative strategy that they're putting forward in this is how do you get it embedded into the school, into the everyday thing, so that you can't get it out. Using the example of City Elementary, a racially diverse school in a small city in the Southeast U.S., I focus on the role of counter-narrative in embedding CRT and anti-racism more foundationally in school identity. I first give background on counter-narrative in relation to CRT and outline its various functions, with a focus on the function of activism. I then use the example of City Elementary to show how counter-narrative, as a proactive form of strategy, one rooted in critical race methodology, can help embed critical race praxis in racialized school spaces. So this is it. This is how you go from getting a school that actually, thinks about their students as individuals, moves toward the idea of thinking about everybody on the basis of race. That's not to say there are not race issues in this country. That's not the problem. That's not what I'm going after with this. The point is I'm just highlighting here for you. This is how the narrative, counter-narrative, if you will, works. And you'll notice it. You'll notice it as I talk through some of the examples in here, and you'll notice it if you read the article. It's always about narratives. Disrupting the dominant narrative and inserting your own narrative. It's never about the truth. And it's always about power, too. Who's in power and who's got it. And so we'll see here in that kind of thing what to do. CRT is a scholarly tradition that uses an interdisciplinary approach to analyze the embedded nature of racism in U.S. society. Notice that is the assumption straight away with CRT. As you know, that is the first tenet of CRT. CRT assumes racism is present everywhere. They never actually prove it. They just assume it. CRT counters these narratives. Wait a second. These narratives also affect the way CRT counters these narratives, being what they view as the dominant narratives, by illuminating how race is a fundamental component to ongoing national issues of legal injustice, residential segregation, health and educational disparity. The goal is to place race at the center of scholarship and to focus attention on race and racism rather than understanding race as a comparison for white normative assumptions. Again, illuminating how race is a fundamental component. They assume that race is the reason for so many different things. That race and racism is the reason for any disparity that exists. It is an assumption that is always made. The counter stories of administrators of color show how personal experiences of racism make them more responsive to students of color and more able to challenge deficit perspectives used against these students. Another line of counter-narrative work is in higher education, which has focused on experiences of both faculty and students. For example, with regard to faculty, counter stories by scholars such as Doherty and Matias expose the contradictory claims universities make about their own commitments to equity, critically analyzing how institutions use certain diversity programs and hiring initiatives focused on faculty of color to both resist broader institutional change and take advantage of the labor of faculty of color. With regards to students in higher education, counter-story examples highlight the ongoing harm that daily racism causes students of color. Okay, here's the problem with this. The assumption that they have, and you're going to see this a lot too, this counter-narrative thing is an assumption, and I'm gonna show you in a second why this is like this. Found it down here later on. They are assuming that every student of color has the same experiences, has the same belief and worldview regarding racism, feels like racism impacts them every single day, feels like racism affects their life every single day. When that's quite possibly not true. And also, quite possibly, not saying it's impossible, quite possibly, and also many students who don't have that belief, don't share that philosophy, don't share that belief at all. Many students of color don't share that belief and philosophy at all, that everything of their daily lives is tinged by racism. So that's one point you got to make here, is there's the assumption made as part of this strategy that everybody thinks the same. You're going to see it tinged in here a fair bit. The assumption that all the students of color think the same way, have this particular same viewpoint that racism impacts our daily lives. And so I wanted to bring that up because of that particular aspect here is a common thread I've noticed. Latinx, I just highlighted here because apparently they didn't get the memo that according to polling, most Hispanic people actually don't like that term. Anyway, common tenet of the work above is typo. You guys have a typo in your article. Also, a common in the work also common in the above work is that it shows that as a practice, counter-narrative upholds the CRT tenet of revisionism or revisionist history. Revisionist history re-examines America's historical record, replacing comforting majoritarian interpretations of events with ones that square more accurately with minorities' experiences. Toward the same, counter-narrative specifically disrupts majoritarian narratives that perpetuate myths of meritocracy for white people and victim-blaming and deficit arguments for people of color. Do y'all see something that might be just a little racist in that second sentence that I got highlighted right there? Since when did anybody apply meritocracy only to white people? Just saying. Just saying, guys. I call that pretty nasty right there. And this is also the revisionist history. Notice it's revisionist history, and it's again about one person's interpretation of events versus another. It's never about getting at the truth. Nobody I know who is against critical race theory has been against the idea of teaching the negatives of history or how this impacted particular or how minorities are impacted or what kinds of things. All about teaching slavery, the Tulsa Race Massacre, all of it. Do you really think we don't? Do you really think that there's a thing there? Most people are actually for teaching a very accurate version of history. They're not teaching, it's not about not teaching history. Let's put it that way. For white people in particular, these master narratives reify in our minds the sense that U.S. society is fair and becoming more progressive in terms of race, and we ourselves are innocent of complicity in racism. I just highlighted this one in particular because it's because of the thing here is the lack of data on the part of the author here. And for the record, I don't know who the author is. I haven't looked up anything about the author. I'm just reading the article. Just going off what's in the article. So don't know what the author has done otherwise. Don't know who the author is. Don't know what kind of person. I have just, the only thing that I know about the author himself is from this article. I haven't looked up anything about them. Counter-narrative as a strategy, then, is a way to purposefully center these more critical perspectives and epistemologies of people of color with regard to embedded racism. So, epistemologies of people of color with regard to embedded racism. For those who don't know, the epistemology is basically how is the study of how we gather knowledge in here. And so different peoples have different ways of gathering knowledge. Things about ways of knowing, if you will, that go on in here. And that's where I find this one interesting. And again, I have to ask a question. Do you presume that based upon somebody being a person of color, they have a particular epistemology just because they're that person of color? What about where they grew up, how they grew up, what neighborhoods, and how does a person grow up? What culture did they grow up in? There's a lot of things that influence the epistemology kind of aspect, but that gets ignored in here actually, or at least it seems that way. So CRT literature offers four overlapping functions of a counter-narrative, providing new, often untold narratives to understand power. Notice again, no emphasis on the truth. It's always about power. Deconstructing majoritarian narratives on race, serving as a cure for silencing and fostering activism. Delgado and Stavanchik specify the first three in their work, but the wider body of CRT scholarship also includes the fourth function of fostering activism. I briefly elaborate these functions and provide examples of each. The only reason I'm rereading that is because actually from the book, I believe this is Critical Race Theory and Introduction, they do actually call CRT an activist ideology in the book, from what I recall, and others can correct me on that if I'm wrong. Counter-narrative, providing new narratives to understand power. Counter-narrative helps us understand racial power differently. That is, it's specifically frames race not as a neutral concept, but one that is always about power. This is their assumption. Understanding. This is the CRT assumption, and the counter-narrative puts that assumption into play, puts that assumption into the dialogue. Just thinking about that. The counter-narrative is a tool here. And it's not really a counter-narrative as much as it's a narrative, but anyway. CRT hopes to demystify the notion of a racially neutral society and tell the story of a highly racialized social order. Tell another story of a highly racialized social order. A story where social institutions and practices serve the interests of white individuals. Story can be true or false. You know? And this is why I'm harping about the fact that this says nothing about what the truth is. Stories can be true or false, and I tend to think that this thing here, that society is structured to serve white interests, that CRT has, I think it's false. So, it's a story. That's a story, that's for sure, but it's not necessarily true. Let's see. In an education example, Cook and Dixon use composite counterstory to provide a more contextual, race-focused understanding of school reform efforts in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Counter to the master narratives that use deficit perspectives to portray New Orleans public schools as being in disarray and unsalvageable before Katrina, the authors use the stories of black teachers in the district to one, situate the school problems, not in teacher or administrative practice, but in larger systemic racism, and two, convey the value of black educators in the lives of New Orleans students. In sharing this counter-narrative, Cook and Dixon expose the racialized power dynamics of school reform, challenging interpretations of that reform as colorblind or not harmful to students and communities of color. The reason I highlighted this is because counter-narrative is one thing, but it's also a nice way to get yourself out of taking responsibility for any problems. To redirect things to situate the school's problems not in teacher or administrator practice, but in larger systemic racism. In other words, what the school administrators and the teachers are doing is not the problem, according to this counter-narrative. It's absolving teachers of it absolves teachers and administrators and staff in the schools of responsibility that way. Deconstructing majoritarian narratives of race. In illuminating a relationship between race, racism, and power, again, presuming that everything with this is about power and all that, and presuming that society is racist. That's the presumption that is made entirely throughout. Counter-narrative also serves a destructive function, and that is the point here. Counter-narrative is not just an alternative interpretation of racial disparity, but an attempt to tear down those master narratives that normalize white supremacy. You'll notice they never give a definition for white supremacy, and they do not mean the traditional definition that liberals use. That's not what they're talking about here when they say normalize white supremacy. Similarly, Atwood and Lopez explain that counter-narrative is, quote, a tool for conducting policy analysis by challenging normative assumptions of race and politics that go unnoticed or unquestioned. As analysis, counter-narrative specifically deconstructs the idea that racial disparity is a result of normal or justifiable occurrences. Again, another typo. Here. So, again, and I'm gonna actually say this here, is that Coleman Hughes pointed this out. He called it the disparity fallacy, and I tend to agree. And it's come up a couple of other places. What they tend to do with CRT is to say that any disparity that exists between groups is because of discrimination, racism, or what have you. And that's what they're trying to push for here with counter-narrative. Deconstructs the idea that racial disparity is a result of normal or justifiable occurrences. For one thing, that's not what people are saying when they point out the disparity fallacy. They're not saying that discrimination is not a possible reason for it, but you cannot say that it's the only reason for it necessarily until you provide hard proof for that, which is never done to my knowledge. Never been done. Serving as a cure for silencing. Another function of counter-narrative is that it serves as a cure for silencing. A majoritarian story distorts and silences the experiences of people of color and others distanced from the norms such stories reproduce. Majoritarian narratives often come in the form of stock stories that depict the U.S. as inherently racially equitable, and in doing so, erase the struggles and fortitude of people of color who have challenged and still challenge the U.S. to live up to its democratic ideals. Counter-narrative is one way communities can respond and build affirmation and solidarity. It helps affirm daily experiences people of color have with racism and resist attempts to gaslight their racialized narratives, thus serving as a means of psychic preservation. Daily experiences people of color have with racism. Again, I can think of multiple folks on my own Twitter feed. Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry, Thomas Sowell, Carol Swain, Chloe Valderi, keep on going down the list, who do not agree with this philosophy that they have daily experiences with racism. Who do not agree with this philosophy, but their philosophy here gets ignored. And you know, Eric Smith is another one. He talked about it, how he was lambasted for criticizing critical race theory. And he is a Black rhetorical scholar. I think that's the right title. I'm sorry, Eric, if I got it wrong. It's skipping my brain right now. I'm sorry if I got it wrong. But there's a whole bunch of folks who would not agree with this philosophy that they put forward. And it's amazing that this gets ignored. But they don't want it to be, because I think, looking right here, a majoritarian story distorts and silences the experiences of people of color and others distance from the norms such stories reproduce. No, I don't know, but they continue to ignore certain folks here. So, and again, here with this one, Socia Provencia et al. Explain that testimonios are narratives of struggle and resilience to structural oppression at intersections of race, ethnicity, class, gender, language, sexuality, and residency status. Those authors use testimonio to resist isolation and oppression in the academy and validate their own experiences as Chicana scholars. Again, for one thing, Latinx is not necessarily a popular term in the Hispanic community. But anyway, one of the other things here is, again, what if a scholar, person of color background, doesn't agree with this philosophy? This gets ignored. Again, presumption that everyone of a sane background has these experiences of being oppressor or oppressed, or however. That is the assumption that is built in because racism is everywhere. And this is the counter-narrative thing that we're getting into. And well, trust me, it gets crazier. A fourth function of the counter-narrative, one that I want to focus more in this piece, is that it inspires activism. Because they are based on collective experiences, counter-narratives can empower people to act against racial oppression. There's the thing. Counter-narratives, as they call it here, are the story of everybody in that group. You are in a particular group, you are lumped into that group, and you have these experiences, and this narrative fits those experiences that you've had. Except you might not have. Because they don't think of you as an individual with a counter-narrative. They think of you as part of the collective. They think of you as part of this collective, that you have experienced this or you have experienced that. So counter-narratives are collective narratives. They are not about an individual and their individual experiences, but pushing a collective narrative. Amiot et al. 2020 use CRT to disrupt dominant narratives of race, and which I'm going to come back here for a second. I apologize, but that's the reason why you see them using the thing of people of color and their things of daily experiences of racism and what have you. They don't ever account for the fact that somebody who is a person of color does not agree with that. And I'm presuming there are very many who do not agree with that narrative that they experience racism every day. In their efforts, they did use counter-narrative to document the everyday lived patterns of racial discrimination experiences of students of color, which gave them a lens to frame their equity work. Document the everyday lived patterns of racial discrimination. How much was there actually in there students who said, Nah, I got great friends. Nothing happened. Never had a problem in this school. Why are you coming to bother me with that? I doubt it. I doubt they incorporated that, to be honest. There seems to be a lot of cherry picking that happens in these things, which is, again, why do you not talk about that? You will see it through this article. They never talked about the instances where a parent or a student of color, to use their language, said, no, I don't agree with this. you'll see it later. They never talk about that. They always talk about the white parents being the one who are resisting. The white parents are the ones who are resisting. They never talk about the black students who resist, or the black parents who resist, or the Hispanic parents who resist, or the Asian parents who resist. Awful lot of cherry picking that goes on, actually, with this article, and doesn't necessarily surprise me. Based on the case of City Elementary, explore the idea, importantly for counter-narrative to effectively analyze, importantly for counter-narrative to explore the idea of counter-narrative as a strategic part of critical race methodology and ethnography. That's a big thing in this article. Importantly, for counter-narrative to effectively analyze the categories that continue to stratify schools, it must be guided by tenets of CRT. Racial realism, that's the tenet that racism is everywhere. Interest convergence is the idea that a white person will only act upon helping a person of color or somebody who's an oppressed person, if you will, if it benefits them. That's interest convergence. The importance of experiential knowledge, etc. And that's the lived experiences thing that cannot be challenged. If I have a lived experience of racism, it cannot be challenged. Furthermore, because the goal of counter-narrative is to disrupt normative assumptions, it must be guided by the tenets of integrity, authenticity, sincerity, righteousness, and justice in order to present an alternative, more racially just narrative. I very strongly suspect those 5 words do not mean the same thing as what the rest of us do. I have no idea. I haven't read this particular, I'm pretty sure that's a book. I haven't read that particular book to know what they mean here, but I'm very sure those 5 words do not mean the same thing as it does for the rest of us. So, to create a narrative rooted in racial justice, I suggest the counter-narrative can also, in addition to be a reactive to dominant narratives, be practiced proactively. In a quote, I often like to use John Calmore explains the purpose of CRT is to, quote, construct a social reality and direct operation within it. What they're talking about with this is counter-narrative being the tool to do that. Counter-narrative can help construct such a reality, and below I show how City Elementary has learned to use counter-narrative proactively for that purpose. The narrative is still born out of resistance to dominant narratives, but it has also helped the more racially conscious faculty and administrators operate within racist educational structures more on their own terms. In this way, counter-narrative is not only analysis, but also a form of strategizing that can contest, refute, and offer a different reality from that which is offered under the realities of white supremacy. In fact, because the tenet of racial realism posits that racism is inherent to U.S. society, i.e. it will never be eliminated, strategizing against specific instances of white supremacy in specific contexts is a major goal of CRT methodology. In other words, this is the narrative that they want embedded that you can never get rid of. This is the counter-narrative is what he's putting forward, and the strategy that he has in here is what he's putting forward is to get this counter-narrative, this set of ideas embedded in a school. And particularly with teachers and administrators. Not so much with the students. That's different. This is more so about the school itself and the school administration, from what I can read. For the past 7 years, I've been working on a critical race ethnic project. So this is 7 years been going on. That's not entirely true, and I will tell you why in a minute. Some of our successes over the years have been creating... Okay, so they've been doing this for a while. That's the main point, is what I want to say there, what needs to be said there. I am not going to read this section because this is basic... I'm not going to read all of this section because this section is actually basically the guy... the guy's degrading himself, is pretty much what it is. Talking about his positionality, which is his knowledge, the knowledge that he has and the privilege that he has because he's a white person. It's very degrading. Let's see. Toward that end, but this is the one point I want to say, and it relates to the 7 years nonsense. Towards that end, I specifically do this work in my own community. City Elementary is located in the community where I have lived for the past 20 years, worked as a public school teacher, and been involved with anti-racist educational community organizations. So, in effect, he's not been doing this for 7 years, this project. This is the culmination of 20 years of him being there, essentially. The official project may well have been 7 years, but he's been there for a lot longer, working on this stuff. 20 years. Think about that, 20 years. The research method I have used with City, and especially its key participants, is a dialogic approach to critical race ethnography. This has to do with dialogue, conversation. Early on, the team and I decided the school's main barrier was white supremacy. To counteract the school's complicity in white supremacy via curriculum, instruction, and discipline practices, we have used CRT, concepts such as whiteness as property, and racial spaces to collaboratively analyze how white supremacy is normalized via day-to-day school practices. Notice you never give a definition. There's never a definition, and it is not the definition that you and I think it is. This is where New Discourses comes in hand. Go to newdiscourses.com there, and you can actually see it very clearly what they actually think white supremacy is. In doing so, we've tried to sustain critical race praxis, use an ongoing cycle of using CRT to hone practice and practice to inform theory with the intention of working towards racial equity in specific contexts. Some white team members, though very committed to racial equity in general, and the team's efforts in particular, have made the same missteps I have by embedding CRT concepts and faculty of color meetings and dialogue. We have been able to make team meeting spaces where we counter white discourse. When white team members have promoted white perspective on race, e.g. privileging the discomfort of white teachers or denying the saliency of race, we have made an agreement not to resist when team members of color name our recentering of whiteness. Furthermore, as a team, we made an agreement that white team members also had to take on that interventionist role with each other. I want you to keep this in mind, because right here, for one thing, that's the white fragility fallacy that's being played in. Here, I think. The fallacy of white fragility. I'm not going to call it the theory of white fragility. It's the fallacy of white fragility, because white fragility is a logical fallacy. It's a Kafka trap. So, there is that here. But the point that I want to make with this section, and you're going to see this crop up a lot when I get to the actual counter narrative. You're going to see a lot of the things that I talked about a lot crop up here, about being about power, being about everybody having the same thing, being the collective. You will see it come up many, many times as I go into this a bit more. And I'm doing this just because this is an example of a study that is not a study at all, but this has the veneer, the authority. I'm going to say it again. This has the authoritative veneer of a peer-reviewed study, and so it's going to get used somewhere to justify doing something. Something like this is going to happen. Something like what they describe in this thing is probably going to happen in another school if it hasn't already. So this is why I want you to keep this in mind, is this is things to look out for. Okay. I don't think I want to stick around on this section too much, but narrative data presented in this article come from formal, informal, planned, and impromptu one-on-one and group conversations I had with teachers, administrators, and equity team in my 200 visits since 2013. The formal conversations were all audio recorded and transcribed, and I took field notes and or journaled for the informal ones, resulting in over 2,000 pages altogether. I've analyzed the data in a variety of ways for different purposes. Here, I specifically look for narratives that showed how the team learned to resist dominant narratives on race and how they learned to forefront a school identity centering anti-racism. Almost said the wrong word. Specifically, I asked questions as to how the four functions of CRT counter-narrative were exhibited in the data. To explicate how these functions were evident in the team's work, I used several key CRT tenets: a critique of liberalism, racial realism, and interest convergence. This analysis has revealed how the team became better at adhering to a CRT approach over time, which helped us better realize the activist function of counter-narrative. Therefore, I organized the representation of the data as a narrative journey, a story of how an equity team progressed in our... God, this grammar is awful. A story of how, as an equity team, progressed in our capacity to use CRT to develop school identity rooted in anti-racism, and also how the strategic use of counter-narrative was important to that effort. In the next 4 sections, I present the narrative of how the equity team learned to use counter-narrative as a strategy using a combination of counter-narrative and more traditional ethnographic representation. In the first section, we're afraid to tell people things, engaging counter-narrative to disrupt whiteness. I use composite counterstory, which involves fictionalized narratives drawn from interview transcripts, field notes, memos, and other research data, creating characters that are representative of several participants rather than just a single participant with a pseudonym. I use example conversations across the third and fourth years of the project, condensing them into a single representative conversation. In other words, in the first section, the conversation we're going to see there, it's fiction. It's entirely fiction. It didn't actually happen in that order. It might have been parts pulled from here and there, but it didn't actually happen in that order. I include voices of white team members, including myself in this section, to follow Milner's recommendation that including dominant narratives along with counter narratives can give fuller context to in which those counter narratives exist. So this is an interesting thing. What he's assuming is like, if you're white, you're automatically speaking the dominant narrative. Is one of the things, is something I think he's assuming there. I doubt that, because you all ended up being on the same narrative by the time you were done. So that's the thing. In the second, third, and fourth sections, I use a more traditional ethnographic representation of the data, drawing on critical race ethnography to provide examples of how counter-narratives from the key team members of color helped the team learning to better embed CRT concepts into our work. In other words, while not counter-narrative presentations, they show how counter-narrative can be used as a strategy. This is why I say it again. This is not a study. This is an activism guidebook, is what this is. This is why I think people should be reading this, probably. That's not necessarily just me. Part of the reason I'm critiquing this is because this is activism masquerading as scholarship. In the second section, what about another perspective, forefronting counter-narrative, I discuss how we as a team began to better use counter-narratives in direct response to dominant narratives. You'll see that in a second. In the third section, this is who we are, embedding counter-narratives into school culture, I show how the team was able to further promote an anti-racist school identity by more proactively embedding counter-narrative into school structure. The examples show how, by, again, disrupting whiteness and dominant narratives on anti-racism, such as de-race discourses about all students, the team started to employ counter-narratives' activist function. We were able to prevent interference with our efforts and lay the groundwork for more productive anti-racist work. In the fourth section, I discuss the effect that the strategic use of counter-narrative had at City, and I share how key participants have explained the value of our work in their own terms. We're afraid to tell people things. I started the narrative journey in the third and fourth years of the project. Why not start at the first 2 years? Quick question. Among those narratives were calls for action without In our attempts to carry out this work, it was not uncommon for some white teachers to respond to our efforts with dominant narratives on race. Notice it's just the white teachers that they point out here. They never tell you any of the examples about Black teachers or Hispanic teachers. And, presuming those teachers are all white, and how many of them might be biracial, we don't know. Just saying. Among those narratives were calls for action without reflection on systemic racism, just tell me what to do, liberal approaches to change, we're all at different levels, people might not be ready for this, and a combination of personalizing racial analysis and privileging white emotions over those people of color, which I discuss more extensively in 2 other publications. Oh, 2 other studies, okay. As a team, we sometimes let these dominant narratives influence our work, and it was counter-narratives from our more racially conscious team members of color that helped us better counter them over time. There can be no disagreement. There can be no difference of opinion. Again, in the equity team, you were not allowed to have a difference of opinion. Ultimately, you were not allowed to have a difference of opinion. Cook and Dyson explained that a composite counterstory helps capture the shared history that people of color have with racism, so this counter-narrative captures the shared experience that teachers of color had specifically with master narratives on race at the city. So this is a long conversation that follows. I don't want to necessarily spend all the time right now reading through this, but I encourage you to go do it, because I think there's probably 1 or 2 things I can highlight from in that conversation just to make the point. I'm not trying to cherry pick. I'm really just editing down a bit for time here, because I don't want this video to drag on forever. Let's see. Yeah, there's not too much in here that I don't want to read, but what I will point out with this, just to make the point for you, Go back and read this, particularly, if you get a hold of this paper, come back over and go back over and read it. Like I said, I'll put this up in locals. But the thing that I want you to look for here is that there can be no disagreement here. You have to do it this way. We must do it this way. That's where this tends to go in this conversation, is what I noticed. And again, this is a composite counter story, which means it's stitched together from different conversations in here, and is not representative necessarily of it's not an exact representation of an actual conversation. In these kinds of conversations, white team members like Tammy and myself often wavered on how much we want to push faculty, especially white faculty, when we thought they would become uncomfortable. On the other hand, black team members like Gloria and Michelle clearly point out the connection between appeals to discomfort, white supremacy, and school structure. Again, I point to this because differences of opinion are not allowed here. Then that conversation right there, that little bit right there tells me that this counter narrative structure thing, one of the things it's designed to do is to take out any divergent opinion, or to minimize any divergent opinion with this. The other thing here that's going on with this is the assumption of the white fragility fallacy, where any discomfort is about the fact that you don't want to be challenged about your racism. And that's not that is a logical fallacy, so much so. Jonathan Church writes about this a lot, has written about this a lot. So has James Lindsay, so has many others who pointed out that it is incredibly logical fallacy here. So that's the other things that get pointed out. But it is a way to shut somebody down. It is a very nasty way to shut somebody down when you're having when you have a difference of opinion on why something is and how you should go about doing something. It's a very nasty way to do that. Counter-narrative, though, this counter-narrative thing works it into the dialogue that you can't disagree. What about another perspective? Forefronting counter-narrative. By the end of the fourth year, the team utilized the lessons from conversations like the one above to sustain a shift in our narrative as a team. We first made a commitment to actively name racism and white supremacy more frequently, whether it be one-on-one interactions, small group meetings, or our faculty training sessions. With this reframing, we employed specific strategies to counter race evasive narratives and forefront a more racially aware one. I discussed some of these strategies in other publications. So there we go. Here, I want to focus on how, especially in larger group conversations and faculty meetings, we learn to use the strategy of purposefully redirecting conversations so they follow the narrative we want to tell. Let me repeat that. Here, I want to focus on how, especially in larger group conversations and faculty meetings, we learn to use the strategy of purposefully redirecting conversations so they follow the narrative we want to tell. This is not about the truth as much about getting your preferred narrative out there. There can be no disagreement in the counter narrative. There can be no disagreement. There can be no difference of opinion. You can't have it. That's the main point with this. You cannot have it. And that was the thing that struck me with this. This is more so about a strategy of shutting down any disagreement than anything else. It's an activism guidebook. You should really believe it when they say it, because that's what it comes off as. This is not a study. This is not a scholarly study in the slightest. Let's see. So here's a couple of examples they have, and these are short, so I'll read through these. The team was running an activity where the faculty would collaboratively create a curriculum about race, racism, and whiteness. White teacher: do we have to use these terms with kids? I think we should just talk about fairness and if it's fair to treat people that way. We don't have to mention whiteness or race. Those terms are harsh. I understand not everyone is comfortable with this, but we as a school have decided this is important. Can someone explain how these terms can be used with our students? So ignore you'll see a pattern here with these, and they say it themselves down below. The team led an activity where the teachers analyzed examples at the school that involved racial disparity in discipline. White teacher: I don't think this is necessarily about race. I feel like we're always making things about race. Okay, you're allowed to feel that way. Does anyone here feel differently about this? Think about it. The team presented the school's new belief statements on cultural equity, which the district had encouraged all schools to do, and ours focused on addressing white supremacy. White teacher: we don't all believe that. I know I don't. You can have that perspective, but this is what we as a school have decided, and we're going to move forward with them. Can someone tell me why this focus is important to them? Do you notice something interesting? Do you notice the redirection in here? In each example, the team member acknowledged the comment, but then redirected the conversation back to one that's centered on the significance of race. In the first example, after that interaction, the rest of the meeting focused on how to make these terms comprehensible for elementary school students. In the second, several teachers used the terminology we were working on, whiteness as property and racial spaces, to analyze school-based examples. In the third, some teachers explained how anyone could be unintentionally complicit in white supremacy, so it was important to be honest about it. The meeting then proceeded with our next set of activities. Here's the crazy one. We would still engage with race-evasive comments when we felt they would be productive, i.e. one-on-one or small group discussions about how daily practices could be complicit in white supremacy. However, when we wanted to push the work further, e.g. when the entire faculty worked collaboratively to develop an anti-racist curriculum for students rather than engage the resistance, we quickly acknowledged it, but did not let it take over the discourse of the moment. Instead, we immediately moved on to the narrative we wanted to forefront. In doing so, the team began to shift the identity of the school to one that was more explicitly about anti-racism, getting us closer to building the reality we wanted to work within. Team members, and especially Dawn and Erica, began explaining that their colleagues needed to step it up and get with the program if they wanted to be part of it. The counter-narrative that they're talking about here starts subtly. That's what he's talking. He's describing it subtle, beginning, slowly but surely, then redirects. But this is not actually healthy for a working environment because you're actually utterly ignoring people's different perspectives and making them feel unheard when you do this. You're actually making certain people feel unheard. So this thing, it wouldn't surprise me if people want to run away. It wouldn't surprise me if you lost teachers doing that, if there are good teachers there who didn't want this nonsense involved here. So, but notice the counter narrative here is that, yeah, okay, we're going to acknowledge that you think that and what have you, but we're going to just go on to the next thing. That shuts down viewpoint diversity. That absolutely shuts down viewpoint diversity when not everybody can be heard and we can't work out our differences over things. That absolutely shuts it down when you're so focused on this narrative. This must be the narrative. This must be what we want. See, this is the difference between ideology and scholarship, or activism and scholarship. Real scientific work, real scientific scholarship would want to be hearing the competing arguments and ideas and things. This does not. This counter-narrative is all about shutting down any divergent viewpoints subtly. They don't come right out and say it, subtly so. This is very anti-science. This is who we are, embedding counter-narratives into school culture. There was initially, as mentioned above, in the 5th year of our work, we created a set of belief statements for the school with regard to equity. So we've gone through the team figuring out and embracing its counter-narrative, the equity team. Then we get to pushing it on the other teachers, kinds of things in the development of curriculum and what have you. And so you keep pushing that narrative in there. And now we're at the belief statements reflective of the entire school. There was initially some talk about using phrases such as, we believe that all voices are important, we believe that all students are capable of success. As I heard those suggestions, I recalled previous comments by Sonia about needing to be explicit about naming white supremacy in our work. So I ultimately asked the question, do you think you will get flack if you named on white supremacy directly in your belief statement? Several team members quickly responded. And the general answer there was no. The initial ideas about all voices and all students show how liberalism can dominate school discourse typos plenty in this paper. How liberalism can dominate discourse even when they are engaging in race-focused equity work. Remember, critical race theory doesn't like liberalism. Critical race theory is very illiberal and authoritarian. And that should be shown by the fact that these counter-narratives don't like divergent viewpoints at all. You can't have a divergent viewpoint unless it's one that mostly agrees. And this is a very subtle way to shut it down. This is why this is very anti-science. This is not going to help at all. Let's see. So, luckily, the key participants in the team questioned the race neutrality of those statements, explaining that we had made a commitment to be race-focused in our equity work and to specifically focus on whiteness. So this is what the team created. I'll let you all read those at your leisure. With these statements, we constructed the school beliefs on our own terms, in effect embedding our counter-narrative into the school structure. In the 6th year of the project, the principal began sharing them at the beginning of all faculty meetings and communication about the school to the district office, school board, and community. And by the 7th year, in the beginning of the year, email messages in school presentations to parents. Using belief statements to help build the narrative that being anti-racist is a central part of our school identity has helped us further embed anti-racism into school practice and culture. So there it is. You've gone from, this is the strategy of counter-narrative. In the equity team, you go with a little bit at a time, you push it there. Then you go out to the full larger group and you've taught people how to counteract certain things, how to redirect, how to ignore people who have different opinions and shut them down. And you've also now gone to embedding the belief statements into the structure of the whole school. Gaining control of the narrative, success and cautions when sustaining an anti-racist school identity. By engaging with the perspectives and CRT concepts, we also learned how to disrupt the narratives that sustain that power. The stories above show how we learned to forefront the perspectives of our colleagues of color and to better understand power and effects of the power and effects of racism and whiteness. Again, this is all about power. It's never about the truth. By engaging with their perspectives and CRT concepts, we also learned how to disrupt the narratives that sustain that power. Furthermore, we learned how to develop a collective counter-narrative and organize around it, thus better living up to the counter-narrative's activist function. And this is the key point right here. This counter-narrative, A, is collective. It's about all the different groups that are oppressed and how they're oppressed and what have you, despite the fact that if you're a member of that group and you may not feel like you're oppressed, things like that. You know, I think of like Gabrielle Clark and others who are just like, what the hell, man? I'm not oppressed. What are you talking about? And there's so many folks I know online, brilliant scholars who are like, who would look at this and be like, what the fractal are you talking about? And so there's that for sure with this. But also the counter narrative is what is being organized around in this strategy. Organizing around, this is what you're pushing. This is the thing you're organizing around. How do you push this? How do you push this thing? How do you push this thing? And they laid it out for you quite nicely in this article. Students and families, and especially families of color, are also responding positively to the school's overt focus on anti-racism. This is not to say there have been no complaints by just a handful of white parents, but that more parents are expressing to teachers and administrators that they appreciate the work, that they appreciate what the school is doing. Some have even asked if they could help with the equity work or be involved in the training themselves, which the team has started to plan for. Also, while we are still assessing the impact on students, team members consistently report that students of color express more pride in the school and are feeling more affirmed, and graduated students have reached out to tell them how much they miss City. So, one thing on this. This is an elementary school. By the way, this is an elementary school where this is being done. Also, I gotta say, no data here. No data, no information, totally anecdotal. So my 2 words on that is prove it. You say this, prove it. Here. And the other thing I gotta say is you constantly say it's just a handful of white parents. It's just a handful of white parents. Are you really? Really? I kind of doubt that, to be honest. And again, that's what I just want to say. Can you prove it? Because this is completely anecdotal. There's not actually any evidence to back this up. This is anecdotal with respect to the authors at this point. I'm not expecting them to, but that is my comment. Oh, yeah, and I was also going to say, feeling good is one thing. Doesn't mean you're doing good. You can feel good about being at something, but if you're not mastering concept, well, you can feel good about the fact that you didn't master something. And actually, they finally do admit it down here. There have also been concerns over test scores, which are admittedly on the low end for the district. So in other words, you're implementing all of this, and the students are not at all mastering math, science, writing, reading, things that are kind of important. The large majority of white parents have kids in the school, The large majority of parents of white parents with, that shouldn't be have, that should be with. That makes more sense to be with. The large majority of white parents with kids in the school have actually been supportive, but as a white parent in the district myself, I hear negative comments about school from other white families. City also faces actual obstacles to racial equity. Like every other school in the district, it still needs to follow a standardized curriculum that does not recognize the breadth of knowledge and skills that students bring with them to school. These are elementary school kids. What knowledge do they have of the world that is unique and things that they bring with them? Skills, maybe, but you're in school to be learning a lot of things. And particularly as an elementary schooler, 1st through 5th grade, you're in school to learn a lot of things. You don't know a whole heck of a lot. So, no, I don't buy that. There's not a whole breadth of knowledge and skills that students necessarily bring with them to school. They're in there to learn a lot. And they may be very talented, very quick learning, quick in picking up things, what have you. That's different. But, yeah, no, there's not a whole breadth of knowledge and skills necessarily that students bring with them. They are learning a lot of these things in school, or at least they're supposed to be. Students have explained they're not getting the same support at their new schools, as their new schools are not as affirming with regard to the racial and cultural identities. They don't feel like they belong in the same way, and their perspectives are not important. That may be because you've taught them that their race is the most important thing about them. You know? And when they encounter other people who don't feel the same way, that ends up being a shock. Just saying. At the same time, the equity team has created a landscape from which to address these inequities, and this work has helped to create a positive school environment. Great. If it's a positive school environment, are the kids learning anything? Can they master science? Can they master math? Can they do any of that? To paraphrase Dawn's comments, speak to the idea that the team has been attempting to create its own school reality, one that centers anti-racism and what? That is a sentence that, again, makes no sense. One that centers anti-racism and operates within it on its own terms. So, finally made it to the end. Composite counterstory shows, okay, by challenging approaches to equity work rooted in liberalism, they disrupted dominant narratives. That's the thing that counter-narratives does here. When some team members referred to narratives of anti-racism rooted in liberalism, e.g. narratives about all students, the rest of the team was able to use their understanding of how race-neutral discourse only served to maintain racial inequity, and by naming white supremacy, directly promote narratives that exhibit an understanding of racial realism. Those sections show the team learning to use counter-narrative more proactively and strategically, thus engaging its activist function. Finally, the section Gaining Control of Our Narratives shows the effect of centering more racially literate counter-narratives. It shows that by using a counter-narrative strategically, the team was able to create a school-wide anti-racist identity. The journey even shows how schools can easily revert back to white liberal colorblind discourses on race, even when working on racial equity, but also that embedding CRT and ensuring that narratives from educators of color lead joint goals for racial justice, it is possible to foster anti-racist school identities even in cross-racial contexts. Here's the ending I want you to get a kick of. Implications for strategizing. Based on the work of the equity team, however, I argue that schools can utilize counter-narrative to successfully sustain critically race-focused discussions that create space for ongoing strategy. By drawing on the tenets of CRT and racial realism and interest convergence in particular, schools, scholars, and educators can collectively engage counter-narrative to identify and deconstruct the master narratives that impede racial progress in specific contexts, thus working towards its educative and disruptive functions. it's not educative in the sense that it doesn't provide you anything about doing better in math, science, reading, and writing, which we do have problems with in this country because the literacy rate is suffering tremendously. They can also develop and employ counter-narratives to help create more equitable racial affirming practices within the larger context of systemic racism, thus helping it serve as a cure for silencing. Finally, practicing counter-narrative proactively with a purposeful attention to its activist function can serve as a rallying point and strategic action for building school identities that center anti-racism. Again, this is not a study. This is not a scientific study. This is not scholarship. This is not it in the slightest. This is activism, masquerading as scholarship. In fact, this is an activism guidebook for how do you go about bringing CRT and embedding CRT related stuff, wokeism more generally. How do you go about embedding it into schools? This is not proper scholarship in the slightest. And yet, this is published in a peer-reviewed journal. This is published in a peer-reviewed journal, the International... Where is it? Let's go back to the beginning. The International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education as a peer-reviewed study. This is not a study. This is all about activism. This entire article is completely about how do you do activism in a school? How do you go about doing it? And the counter-narrative thing would have to understand is extremely subtle. But it employs everything with CRT involved in there and doesn't allow for any disagreement. The counter-narrative structure like this, that's one of the major draws I have on it, is the counter-narrative structure doesn't allow for any disagreement with it. Any disagreement was shut down in the examples you saw. You saw that. It doesn't make any... It doesn't allow for the diversity of thought that exists amongst communities of color, for lack of a better way to describe it, because they have very many different opinions. The reason I follow Free Black Thought is because of the range of thinkers there that put out amazing stuff. It's awesome. I enjoy reading them. And this whole thing goes on the assumption that every person of color has experiences of oppression and racism every single day. This thing wouldn't know what to do. And you notice they never mention it. They never mentioned any parents of color who disagreed. They never mentioned any students of color who were like, I don't know about this. Though they're elementary school kids, so it's not likely they would have developed the skills to actually challenge the teacher. They don't account for viewpoint diversity, period. They really don't. And it's actually really shocking to see that here. And they don't like the diversity of perspective. They're actually talking about ways to shut it down, and they term it race evasive. And the way they're putting it here is the way I see with most of critical race theory scholarship when I've read it, is that they don't think there can be any logical way that you could disagree with some of the things they put forward. Again, when I read this earlier, I wanted a beer afterwards, and I kind of want one now. No, I'm not going to go get a beer, but I don't drink, but when I'm reading something that drives me to want to drink, that's a bad sign. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful for you all. I wanted to do this video because this is a prime example of something that is masquerading as scholarship that will be used and distributed because it has the veneer of authority that comes from being in a peer-reviewed journal. And so I wanted to bring that up, and I hope for you all this is helpful for those of you who need to know. Anyway, that's it for now. If you like this video and you want more video reviews, let me know. I'm happy to do that. Please like this video if you like this video. That was redundant. Please like this video. If you like the video, hit the like button on the way out the door. Share the video, subscribe to the channel, comment on the video, all that good jazz. Don't forget, you can come over and be a supporter of Shia Sophia on locals.com. I'm actually going to put this in the community, and I think I probably will put it No, well, I'll put this available in the community, this particular article here, because I know it's behind a paywall, but I think people should read it. So I will take the copy that I have and put it there. But anywho, that's it for now. Until next time, I'm Adrian. I hope you stay curious, my friends.